Thanks. So all the foods that are seen as suitable for our soul, say that means it's not just about the nutrition, it's about the spiritual rhythm within those foods. And Maimonides writes about it, and Nachmanides writes about it, talks about the observable nature of kosher species. They talk about, whether they're carnivorous or herbivorous. I mean, and these are all thoughts going through the ages, but based on this idea that there's spiritual and moral guidance from what the Torah's criteria for kosher food are the opposite. So the Rebbe asked, what is it that we can learn from this idea of scales and fins? And then there's an idea that he said there's that the Talmud says that any fish that has scales also has fins. I think there are other, just a very few, but there are some aquatic creatures that have scales and no fins. But that's not fish. And so the Talmud gives us a zoological rule that if it has scales, it has fins. So if so, the Talmud asks, so why does the Torah have to tell us scales and fins? Just say scales. And if it has scales, it has fins. And the Talmud goes into a little bit of some of the details of what the Torah is trying to teach us, more on the technical end of the mitzvah, the severity of the mitzvah. But there is a reality that I've also addressed, that the Torah is telling us scales and then also and fins, even though there really doesn't seem to be a need to add fins, because if it has scales, it has fins. So the way the Rebbe wrote, as far as insight into what it means, said that the fish, the scales and fins, portray for us two elements necessary for a morally functional, a morally healthy life. Scales are like a protective armor almost around the fish, and that represents to us that we need to shield ourselves, our integrity, our loyalty, our morals, our honesty, from alien influences, our attractions, our appetites that can come at us from different areas of the world, whether from people or from, just from situations. So this is the idea of the scales, represents this idea of a sheathing that helps protect us from the outside world. In this case, to help prevent our sense of morality. When we're sitting a quiet moment at home or in study or in prayer, and we can think about how we're going to approach a business deal or maybe a difficult interaction or conversation with a friend or a loved one, and we imagine it and project of how it will play out, and us being who we want to be. Things are not always textbook, and sometimes we have things that we didn't plan for, and on the spot, when something's coming at us, the instinctive response might not be the person we want to be. So the idea of the scales, and this is what we're ingesting into our body, not only for, as I said before, not only for our physical nutrition, but for our spiritual nutrition. And that is something that it represents to us our protection, a protective, we'll call it a sheathing, garb, to make sure that nothing alien pokes at us or gets into us to take us off kilter. What are the fins represent? The fins represent, the fins get a fish from here to there, and it's our drive to produce. It's our drive to be productive. It's our drive to make a difference. It's our drive of ambition. And that is also very important because we're created, we're here for a reason, and we should feel a drive to make a difference in the world. And that's healthy. What the Rebbe was saying is that it's healthy. Ambition is healthy when it's tied to the idea of a protective wall we've created within our souls to make sure we're not taken off course. Because as we all know, ambition that's not anchored in morality can, God forbid, cause a lot of problems for people around and for the person themselves. So you want that to be, the ambition to be anchored in morality. And ultimately, from the Talmud we see, what's the most important between the two is the scales. If you have scales, then you have fins. We mention, the Torah mentions fins also because that's an important thing. We shouldn't think it's okay to just sit at home, in a hermetically sealed moral bubble, and not engage the outside world, and not progress in our own lives and help the world progress. Going in taking more steps towards being the good world it can be, but the bedrock of it is, say, that those protective scales. There, in this, there's a lot. I'm not the kosher industry, and processed kosher is not my bailiwick per se. There's a lot there. Because there's so much, we live in such a sophisticated world, and in food too, and how that all fits into the halacha is worth plenty of speeches or classes. That's not my world so much, but I would just say, or it's really not where I put my head, that one of the things that says that about the scales is that the scales have to be, from the way the Talmud describes them, is they have to come off easily. They fall off easily, and therefore, if a fish has scales, like a swordfish has scales, but it's not considered kosher because to take the scales off, you end up ripping off skin, and that. The Talmud will tell us, doesn't say it about a swordfish. It says it about just the concept of scales. So if it doesn't come off easily, but you have to rip off skin, that's not considered what we're talking about. We're talking about removable scales, easily removable scales. I would just throw in also that I think that number one, in case you're looking in your local supermarket. Tuna apparently have very few scales, but it doesn't have to be totally covered in scales, just some scales. And salmon, which is a kosher fish, and this is something we're going to bump up against going forward also. The names of animals, fish, birds in Torah, and the names they're used by today are not easily translatable. So, and sometimes even what's spoken about today in using English, it could be a common usage that isn't necessarily a scientific usage. So, for instance, I believe it's called rock salmon. Is not kosher. It doesn't have fins and scales, and I don't know if it's actually a salmon per se. Maybe it looks like a salmon. So it's always good to know, to pay attention. If it's processed, we look for a kosher supervision. If not, if someone is getting salmon at your local supermarket, ask them to wash off the knife, because you don't want anything coming from, the squid. And then you want to be able to see that there are scales on what you were eating, what they're cutting for you. They should be able to show you something before, before it's totally skinned. Okay. I think that's as far as the fish are concerned. We'll go to the fowl now, unless there are questions. And it says here 13. Among fowl, you must consider the following loathsome and not eat them. Not only must you not eat them yourselves, they must also not be eaten by others, minors through your agency. For they are to be considered so loathsome that you will not even feed them to your young children, even though they are technically exempt from keeping the Torah's laws until they reach majority. The reason where they get this non-bolded from is that the Torah does seem to emphasize that there's something. I mean, loathsome is a strong word, but it's a fair translation. So it's not just, well, it looks good to me, but I can't have it. My kid's not bar mitzvah, let them have it. This is something we should find more repugnant. You say the griffin vulture, the bearded vulture, and the osprey. So they seem to be comfortable that these are proper translations. Various other species of vulture, every type of species of crow, the ostrich, the cuckoo, the gull, various species of sparrow hawk. 72. Screech owl, the cormorant, the barn owl, the bat, the pelican, the magpie, the stork, the various species of heron, the hoopoe, and the atalef. All other fowl are permitted for consumption. So, and we're going to get into, so here the Torah only tells us what's treif. So if I find something that's not that, biblically, I should be okay. But practically it's not as simple as that. So let's get into the Hasidic insights, and we'll see how far we can get with this. 72 on the left side, the cormorant, which is called, in Hebrew, it's called a sholach. The belief in this cormorant shows up in a cormorant, I believe, eats. I understand correctly from the way it's that the Talmud brings it. It's a bird that eats fish, or at least aquatic creatures in the rivers, seas, oceans. So the cormorant, the belief in divine providence, is a fundamental precept of Judaism. And what the cormorant has to do with divine providence, hang on for a second. However, there are different schools of thought regarding the extent of God's involvement in the intricacies and minutiae of nature. According to some classic Jewish philosophers, God merely supervises the special survival of each vegetative and animal life form. His direct, detailed involvement in every aspect of life of each individual in the species, however, is limited to human beings. Okay, so going back in Torah, and the Talmud, it's a little difficult there. The Talmud doesn't formulate dogmatic principles. It gives us the depth of it, but like Maimonides is probably from the first to actually take from Talmudic knowledge and establish what it considers theological principles. Maimonides' approach to divine providence is one where he says it's that God watches the entire world. God creates the entire world. God doesn't really give personal guidance to every blue jay, cat, and the mouse. God's care focuses on humanity, because humanity does mitzvahs, and humanity is here to bring meaning to the world, and therefore what we would call in Hebrew hashgacha pratis, divine providence, individual guidance, in Maimonides' writings, it seems to be more directed at the human. The Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, on the other hand, taught that all the myriad events constantly happening in our world are divinely executed, in essence forming the ultimate choreographed ballet of existence. Baal Shem Tov, Hasidic life, Hasidic thought, says that no, God is focused and intimately involved with every little wrinkle of our reality, and therefore it's no matter what. It's not just about humanity, it's everything has divine providence. Every leaf turning in the wind, taught the Baal Shem Tov, is doing so by design. It may very well be on its way to a specific location to provide shade for a lowly worm. And there's a story that they're quoting from without getting into the whole story, but the Baal Shem Tov is saying that if you look at that leaf blowing through the air, it wasn't blowing through the air, but it's there because it's giving shade to a worm. In other words, and it's all orchestrated, choreographed by the infinite God, who, I mean, we can't imagine a being having that ability to choreograph trillions of objects, but God, choreographing one, choreographing in trillions, it's the same. God's infinite, and God can do what God can do. But as I said, Maimonides doesn't read in Torah thinking that God does care with such specificity about the animal and vegetative and inanimate world. And Baal Shem Tov, in the Hasidic world, read it otherwise, that it's God does. And the Baal Shem Tov's student, who was the founder of Chabad, Rabbi Shem Zalman of these, cited the following passage from the Talmud in support of the Baal Shem Tov's thesis. Rabbi Shem Zalman was challenged by those who opposed Hasidic life, and they said to him, "How can you believe in that God is so intimately involved in all of life, even the animal life, vegetative, and so on, when Maimonides tells us it's not?" And Rabbi Shlomo Zalman pointed to a Talmudic passage, which everyone agrees with. When Rabbi Yochanan saw a cormorant, which is the bird we're talking about now, he exclaimed, addressing God by quoting the following verse in the Psalms: "Your justice is carried out even in the depths of the sea." On the right side of 72. So Rabbi Yochanan saw this cormorant, and as I say, it's a bird that, like, I guess it dives into the sea and eats sea life, aquatic life. And when he saw it, he said, he exclaimed at the beauty of nature and the wonder of God, seeing God in nature. Wow, God, your judgment even goes into the depths of the sea. What does that mean? Rashi is the primary commentary, both in the Talmud, on the scripture and on the Talmud. So there in the Talmud, he explains that Rabbi Yochanan was referring to how God judges even the fish of the sea, arranging that the cormorant catch and devour those deserving punishment. He said, this fish, why did the cormorant eat that fish and not that fish? That aquatic creature, not that aquatic creature, because that one deserved to be eaten now. That's so the Talmud itself, as Rashi explains it, is telling us that God does care about the specifics of animal life, including which fish should be eaten by a cormorant. Thus, the Talmud states unequivocally that the specific fish the cormorant eats is divinely chosen. Now, to take this one step further, homiletically, it is instructive to note that the Hebrew word for nature, which is teva, like the pharmaceutical company in Israel, teva, it means nature. That's why they gave it that name. Is related to the verb to submerge, letboa. On a grammatical end, on a linguistic end, etymological end, the word for nature and the word for submerge is very, very close to each other, very related. What does that imply? Implying that the divine vitality that is the true source of all life is concealed from our perception, submerged within. That within, by the forces of nature that God sets into effect. What this teaching is telling us is that when you look at nature, and I see a sunrise, and I feel the wind, and I see the trees, and all that goes on around me. It's all magnificent, and you say it's all nature. Who does it? Nature. So in the words of Rabbi Shlomo Zalman, he said, when a miracle happens again and again and again and again, you give it a name, nature, because you get used to it. But the truth is that the rising of the sun, the growth of the tree, the chirping of the birds, these are all godly miracles that there's, and our own lives are all godly miracles every day. And we have to recognize that it's not just nature. Wake up in the morning, we say, thank you, God, that we woke up, because we don't take it for granted. It's one of the God's miracles. It's a consistent miracle, but it's a miracle. So the idea of nature is where God what is something, when something is submerged, it means it's hidden from the sight. That's what it's submerged in something. It's submerged in water, so you see the water, not the object. So God is submerged in nature. That's why nature and submerge are connected, because God, we see nature, but within nature, the maestro of nature is God. God's intimate involvement in everything that takes place is hidden from us by the seemingly independent functioning of the laws of nature. It seems independent to us, but it's not. It's godly. In this context, the hunting of the cormorant not only demonstrates God's providence over all reality, but also serves as an allegory for it. As he draws fish from the sea, the cormorant reminds us that our task in life is to reveal the divine providence that is submerged within the ocean of nature. That by going in, it's not just the idea that, look, this cormorant, Rabbi Yochanan, the Talmud said that the cormorant's eating of that specific winnow is because it's because of God's guidance. But the very idea, the hunting of the cormorant, is an allegory that the cormorant is going into the depths of what's submerged to pull out what's there, and that is the divinity, God's guidance within nature. Let's go now to a closer look. 19, what they call the Atalef. Why did they must have done a lot of research to look into how to best translate each of these words. But the Atalef, they didn't translate. They just put it in, they used the scriptural word. Why is that? Because the sages describe this bird as a nocturnal egg-laying fowl that also nurses its young. This is in the Talmud. And there is no flying creature known today that fits this description. We can't find it. So either it's extinct, or it's not. Right now, it's not within the observable zoology. But they could not find, the authors here could not find something that's a species of bird that fits the Talmudic description of what an atalef is. So they just said atalef, which is safer. Then it says all other fowl are permitted for consumption, and this isn't, this is actionable here. Thus, once the identities of prohibited fowl are known, all other fowl are theoretically permitted. The Torah says these not, the other ones are obviously yes, it's a process of elimination. However, since as stated above, not all the translations of the names of prohibited fowl are known to be precise, this rule can no longer be reliably applied. We have to be very careful with that. Therefore, the only fowl permitted for consumption are those for which there is an established tradition of their being so. So we really go today only on tradition. We know clearly some are non-kosher, and the rest we only go by tradition. Among such fowl are chicken, sparrow, pigeon, dove, duck, turkey, and certain types of quail, geese, and pheasant. And I think I may have mentioned here 2 weeks ago, or maybe I didn't, and it was just in my mind, there's a family descendants of a great rabbi in the 1500s, Shai Halevi Horowitz, known as the Shalah. So his descendants, many of them known, I have several friends who are descendants of the Shalah, they do not eat turkey. In his family, there's a tradition that is not of the kosher birds. It's certainly a very minority view, but I'm just saying it exists out there because it goes just with the tradition. I don't like turkey, but I would eat it. But this family specifically does not. And actually, I'm not going to go. We have 2023 here, so that's not the. Let's go back up though. I want to look. It says on 19, the stork. So what they translate as a stork, the Torah uses the Hebrew name for it is Hasidah. Hasidah is like chassid. It's actually a feminine use of the word chassid. Hasidah means like a feminine chassid. And Rashi here says, and says why? Asks the question, why is it called a chasidah? Now, remember, if you take the Maimonides perspective, I said before that non-kosher animals all have within them non-kosher or non-complementary characteristics that we don't want to ingest into ourselves. So that means all of these animals, these birds, who are morally neutral. We're not saying any of these are evil. Birds don't do anything wrong, and they're not evil, but they have certain natural personalities, which, when expressed in human form, would be just making poor choices. So you have to assume that the Hasidah also has negative traits. Now, it's called a Hasidah. Why is it called a Hasidah? So Rashi tells us because Chasid, a Chasid, or become Hasidic. I mean, the use of the word is kind of fluid, but at its core, Talmudically, the term Chasid comes from the word Chesed, and Chesed means kindness. So, in the terms of the Talmud, before there was a Hasidic movement, many years before, many centuries before there was a Hasidic movement, and Chassid did not mean Chassid it means today. So, the Talmud says, who is a Chassid? A person who does kindness with God, is always worried about what God wants, doing things for God. So, here Rashi tells us here, why is the stork called a Chasidah, a Chassid? Because it does kindness with its other members of its family, with its languages of it with its friends, in other words, with its flock, in sharing the food. It says with food. So they didn't put any of it here. I'm surprised they didn't. Usually they put Rashi into non-bolded. But Rashi says it here that he does that. The stork shows an attribute of kindness in the way I guess the way it shares its food with others in the nest, in the tribe, whatever they call it, the flock. So I remember walking home with my father once, walking to and from shul on Shabbos was always a nice experience. With some time talking to him, and I remember he must have been this Torah portion, and he asked me, why the Hasidah is called Hasidah, and I responded with Rashi's response, and then he said to me, "So what's treif? It's good. It should be a kosher bird. What's treif about it?" And the answer he gave, which is not his answer, but I've seen it later in numerous places. The insight is that the idea of only doing kindness with one's own flock is something that the Torah wants us to find repellent. That it's not, we don't not only kind to our own, but we reach beyond our own to find and to be able to bring kindness to others. Okay. So I guess that's what works for now for the fowl. We'll go to the next page because there is a closer look here, but that's not on these verses. It's on verses from the next page. So let's go to flying, crawling creatures permitted and prohibited for consumption. We'll do 20 through 23. On page 73, you must consider loathsome and therefore not eat any crawling creature that also flies and walks on four legs, such as flies, wasps, mosquitoes, and forbidden species of grasshopper. It says forbidden species of grasshopper because there are, in fact, kosher species of grasshopper, which we don't use today. However, among all the flying, crawling creatures that walk on four legs, you may eat from those that have jointed leg-like extensions above the regular legs, close to the necks with which they hop on the ground, that have four wings, and those wings cover the greater part of their bodies. So there are potentially flying, crawling creatures which we could eat. For among those that satisfy these criteria, you may eat the following: the red locust and all varieties of its species, the yellow locust and all varieties of its species, the spotted gray locust and all varieties of its species, the white locust and all varieties of its species. Nonetheless, it is only any four-legged flying creature that does not satisfy these criteria that you must consider loathsome. You may, however, eat five-legged flying creatures, crawling creatures that do not satisfy these criteria, as long as they're members of the four above named species of locust. Additionally, laws concerning animals prohibited from consumption. Additional laws concerning animals prohibited from consumption will be given presently. Okay, so let's just do the permitted grasshoppers, and then maybe we'll leave it for today. Permitted grasshoppers. Rashi notes that there are many, on the 72 at the bottom of the right. Rashi notes that there are many types of grasshoppers that possess the requisite signs, but that we no longer know which of these are accompanied by the names which are referred to in the Torah. So we don't, in the kosher culture, we don't eat any of them, just we're not sure how to distinguish. However, certain Yemenite communities have preserved traditions regarding which varieties of grasshoppers are permitted. So members of those communities are allowed to eat those grasshoppers even today. This is it's practiced today even in Israel by certain people in the Yemenite community, and that's totally respected as their tradition. We don't eat it. We don't we don't even convert to the Yemenite for a day. It's not within our tradition. But the idea that the Torah does permit some grasshoppers is very clear. We're just not sure what they are. So if it's okay, maybe we'll leave it if there are any questions now, and then we'll pick this up next week, God willing.
Just going back to the spontaneous generation. Yolanda, I thought your question was really on good about the stagnant water, but I think I might have just missed it. You said there did used to be spontaneous generation. That there actually did used to be spontaneous generation.
No, what I said is that the Talmud does talk about spontaneous generation. So and it's not observable today in our science. I don't know. I can't know what used to be, and it stopped. I actually didn't mention that, but certainly it's at least in theory, it's a possibility.
Right, because I actually remember a sixth grade science class when we were going over the history of science that there was a time when humankind thought that there was spontaneous generation because they couldn't see that there were microscopic eggs or whatever sitting in.
Right.
I think the example was always given of a horse's tail would have bugs come out, whatever.
Yeah. It definitely was accepted at the time. I think until maybe it was Louis Pasteur. It was only science only put that to bed in the past, I don't know, 150 years or so. But it definitely was accepted as a reality. So it could be that the rabbis of the Talmud were talking about, listen, if this is what the science of the time tells us happens, so this is what would be the case. This is how we would address it. But they weren't stating that there is such a thing as spontaneous generation, but this is how halacha would address it. I mean, but there's a bit of a wrestle with that because Torah can't contradict reality, observable reality. So one could say, well, we don't see spontaneous generation. One day science will find it. Maybe they will. I don't know. But right now, the whole idea of what's there, the stagnant water, spontaneous generation, it's not practically applied because we don't consider anything to be a spontaneous generation because we have to go with what science tells us.
Okay. All right. Good to hear.
All right. A great week, everybody. Enjoy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome.